In 1799, Washington caught cold on a December ride around Mount Vernon. George's doctors bled him to death, leaving us to wonder who our new nation's first dad might have become had he lived into the new century. While Washington led our infant army, America's actual birth certificate was drafted by our most infuriating visible saint. Tom Jefferson proclaimed, quote, "All men are created equal. I suppose we should have a sick after the men." His first Declaration draft included a rant against slavery, which was deleted by Congress. But he bought and sold slaves throughout his life. At his death, Tom freed only a tiny handful. 2 were his biological children. Jefferson saying of, quote, "life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He praised the common man. He sanctified ceaseless revolution, but he scorned indigenous culture, had little concept of women's rights, feared urban mobs and masses, and ran our first imperial presidency. Jefferson's first wife, Martha Wayles, was the white daughter of a Virginia slave owner. She died in 1782. 5 years later, Tom fathered the first of as many as 8 children with Sally Hemings, our third First Lady. Sally was the enslaved African-descended daughter of Tom's first wife's father. She was thus his half-sister-in-law. Sally was a teenager, and Tom a 40-something, when their first son, who may have looked just like his father, was born. Their de facto marriage spanned nearly 4 decades. Their bedroom was just off his study at Monticello. Tom and Sally had 3 kids while he was president, more than any other first couple. One was named for James Madison, his closest friend, at the request of our 4th First Lady, Dolly. In 1918, that child's grandson, Frederick Madison Roberts, a Los Angeles Republican, became the first African American elected to the California Assembly. He was a close friend of legendary Chief Justice Earl Warren. Many scores of Jefferson Hemings' progeny survive and thrive throughout the United States. Tom's white descendants, born of Martha's daughters Patsy and Polly, for 2 centuries denied their relationship to those born of Sally. But DNA testing has confirmed the lineage. In the 1990s, a tearful public embrace came, of course, on the Oprah Winfrey Show, followed by a group dinner and a jointly published book. Tom and Sally's sexual union first formed in Paris, where Franklin had seduced King Louis into our revolution. The French hated the British. America's essential, charming genius converted that rivalry into the troops and ships that helped get us free. That an absolute monarch would help arm a revolutionary mob that hated absolute monarchy seems absurd, but Ben pulled it off. It later cost Louis a trip to the guillotine. Before the beheading, the French king gave Franklin a bejeweled snuff box, prompting Congress to ban such gifts from foreign leaders. Meant to prevent corruption among our highest officials, this emoluments clause has been glibly trashed by Andrew Jackson, Richard Nixon, and Donald Trump. In 1781, the French fleet Franklin finagled turned the tide at Yorktown. Ignoring the local tribes, the Brits ceded us the continent all the way to the Mississippi. When he inked the deal, Ben donned the same suit he'd worn when those pompous lords made him a revolutionary back in 1774. He hoped that the truce between the new nation and the old, quote, will be lasting, and that mankind will at length, as they call themselves reasonable creatures, have reason and sense enough to settle their differences without cutting throats. For in my opinion, there was never a good war or a bad peace, unquote. Meanwhile, Washington gave up power. He'd kept our ragtag regulars and agrarian guerrillas fighting the Brits for 7 impossible years. He might have made himself dictator. Instead, he went home in 1783 when he quit the army and did it again in 1797, refusing a third term as president. George really wanted to farm, especially his beloved hemp. Unlike so many other revolutionary leaders who become awful dictators, Washington plowed under the idea that our newborn nation needed or would stand for an absolute ruler. Today we spend endless hours arguing about icons like him. Were our founders saints or devils? Love them or hate them? We deify the Indian-killing, slave-owning, anti-King George, the biologically barren father of our country, for his military stamina and for his tolerance, vision, and humble walks away from power. He denounced monarchy and hated a titled aristocracy, but he named the, quote, empire for liberty, unquote, that engulfed the planet. We love Tom Jefferson's magic pen that sang of all men being created equal, but we can't deny the women he dissed, the slaves he didn't free, the indigenous he would ethnic cleanse. Today, evangelicals insist we're a, quote, Christian nation, unquote. Yet the roots of our democracy were with the indigenous and Athenians. Virtually none of our founders were Christian. Franklin, Paine, the Adamses, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Ethan Allen, and much of the urban frontier working middle class were deists, Unitarians, or atheists. Neither the name Jesus nor the word Christian appears in the Declaration or Constitution, nor does the word corporation, our dominant institution. Our revolution remains a shrine to human evolution and, like ourselves, a universe of epic contradictions. We beat Earth's most powerful empire, rooted in the Iroquois Kainariquova, our own confederation, 1783 to 89, allowed no official religion, no king, no titled aristocrats, no president, no taxes, no spies, no unified currency, no standing army. Our wealthy founders profited directly from the Constitution that came next, but they did dedicate it to the general welfare. Many cuts below the Iroquois Confederacy, it was still better than anything else in Europe. Our revolutionary grassroots won us a truly great Bill of Rights. We were, said Ben, a republic, if you can keep it. But have we? Our earth-shattering revolution took a giant leap forward toward true democracy, but somehow stayed with slavery, racism, injustice, intolerance, greed, contempt for women, gays, and nature, and an exceptional addiction to conquest and empire. Our new republic became a mighty beacon of anti-imperial imagery, yet morphed into history's biggest empire. True to our Puritan heritage, wrote Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, quote, "The United States has been at war every day since its founding, often covertly, and often in several parts of the world at once," unquote. Today, we're still an imperfect onion. Our epic unpeeling makes us laugh and cry, often at the same time, while we dance ourselves dizzy up the spiral of evolution. Except now, we've run out of time and space, and our future, if we're to have one, demands some answers. Next, fall, the Constitution/federalism. Summer passions do spend themselves. Our first revolution was born of hope and promise. But the brilliant summer of our newborn ideals gave way to an autumn chill. The grassroots farmers and urban workers who beat the British demanded both freedom and social justice. They took rich Tories' property and distributed it among the community. We dumped the world's most powerful king. We wanted no return to tyranny, even at the hands of our fellow Americans. Our Articles of Confederation were deliberately weak. The states ran the show. The towns and counties kept their militias. The farmers kept their distance. But there was a fatal flaw. Amending the Articles required a unanimous vote of all the states. The structure was too rigid to adapt to changing times. On the home front, vulture bankers and thieving tax collectors swooped down on our heroic winter soldiers. As in every American war to come, our veterans were lionized while fighting and dying. But when they came home, after the obligatory parades and accolades, they were abused and abandoned. Many revolutionary heroes were never paid. Their wounds, financial, physical, mental, spiritual, were poorly treated, if at all. Along the frontier, the heroic Minutemen and their Continental cohorts lost their farms. Plowjogger spoke through the ages for all working people, quote, "I have been greatly abused, have been obliged to do more than my part in the war, been loaded with class rates, town rates, province rates, continental rates, and all rates. I've been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and had my cattle sold for less than they were worth. The great men are going to get all we have, and I think it's time for us to rise and put a stop to it, and have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collectors, nor lawyers." End quote. In January 1787, Daniel Shays, a revolutionary captain, rallied a yeoman brigade. With twigs of hemlock stuck in their hats, some 1,500 armed, quote, regulators, like their 1930s Great Plains counterparts, swarmed through the hills, fields, and forests of western Massachusetts. As would John Brown 72 years later, they marched on an armory, this one at Springfield, to get guns. Sam Adams, once our supreme agitator, now a corrupt servant of urban money, screamed for blood. Under General Benjamin Lincoln, Boston's armed rich, including a swarm of Harvard students, fired into the farmers' ranks. 4 died. A score were wounded. The rebels regrouped, but were too weak. Shays fled to Vermont, then still a democratic republic. The new American elite took Shays' rebellion as a wake-up call. They demanded a strong central government, an uncivil fortress against the grassroots grunts who'd actually won the revolution. From May 25 to September 17, 1787, up to 55 bankers, lawyers, merchants, plantation owners, military men, legislators, business barons, and one genius media maven convened in Philadelphia. In a spacious, high-ceilinged room with large windows and armed guards at the doors, they devised a new government in secret. Invited were no indigenous, except as channeled by Franklin, no yeoman farmers, no women, no non-whites, slave or free, no sailors, no rank-and-file soldiers, no urban workers, no artisans, no unpropertied entrepreneurs. There was no official transcript. Festooned in full uniform, George Washington presided in the chieftain's chair for 4 months and said nothing. These 39 wealthy white men signed the document that chilled the hot passions of anti-authoritarian revolution into the cold realities of an oligarchic central government with a manifest imperial destiny. The new Constitution would serve, quote, the general welfare, unquote. It rid our soil of royal families and titled aristocrats. That much was a major evolutionary leap beyond our European DNA. But as the great Howard Zinn later emphasized, the Declaration's guarantee of, quote, life liberty, and the pursuit of happiness morphed in the Constitution to life, liberty, and property. The new U.S. government was now thrice removed from our original code of laws. Indigenous North America lived amidst a transcendent web of tribal societies established over many millennia, maintained through a highly evolved oral tradition. Then the British imposed their imperial codes. In turn, the Revolution embraced the Articles of Confederation. The coup d'etat of 1787-9 then implanted the U.S. Constitution atop the indigenous imperial Articles layers. Thankfully, our implacable urban radical rural revolutionaries demanded a Bill of Rights. The richer white founders genuflected to Athenian democracy and imperial Rome. Both were built on slavery and suppression of women. But especially through Franklin and Paine, the spirit of our revolution flowed from the Iroquois Kanerikavova and sibling social contracts that blended order, freedom, and democracy into the earth-based legal, social, cultural ecosystem whose indigenous originalism still permeates our DNA. By 1791, the new Constitution was the continent's dominant structural force. But would the new nation be run by Alexander Hamilton's oligarchic elite, by Tom Jefferson's aristocracy of merit, or by the working middle-class masses who were not invited to write the Constitution? Like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the new United States centered on sovereign states sending representatives to a general council. But the Iroquois and the Articles had just one assembly. The new U.S. Congress had, like Rome, a lower house and an upper Senate. They were balanced with an elected executive and an appointed judiciary. There was not a hint of matriarchy. The new federal elite got a national army, taxation, tariffs, courts, currency, and stable commerce amongst ourselves and other nations. Property qualifications for voting, decided by the states, lingered until the 1860s. Free blacks could vote in 5 states. Women could vote only in Quaker-influenced New Jersey, and there only until 1808. An electoral college balanced the small states against the big ones. Slave owners counted each of their chattel for 3/5 of a vote for president and in apportioning the U.S. House. They used that, quote, bonus to dominate both that House of Representatives and the White House until 1861. After the Civil War, the Jim Crow laws let the South still keep a heavy grip on national power, especially through the Electoral College in the presidency. Grassroots farmers and urban workers mostly hated the new Constitution. In a fair national tally, it would have gone down. But to seal the new coup, the new American elite arbitrarily announced the need for 9 of 12 states to approve. The Democratic Republic of Vermont stayed independent until 1793. Then, as made clear by activist attorney historian Stoughton Lynd, the colonial elite birthed an American tradition by rigging the ratification process. In New York, the anti-federalist grassroots won a majority of delegates to oppose the new Constitution. But at the state convention, enough delegates flipped their votes to seal the deal. Some of them emerged with unexplained new wealth. The new Constitution could be amended with 2/3 of Congress, a presidential signature, and then 3/4 of the states. Tough, but doable. The new national organism could change and grow, but first it served the new elite. In reaction, our revolutionary populists demanded a Bill of Rights to resemble the Haudenosaunee codicils. Virginia's was drafted by Madison and Jefferson, both of whom joined Franklin and Washington in studying indigenous law. Still seething over the attack on Shays' rebellion, an angry populace threatened a new revolution. So Madison, who'd initially dismissed the idea, compiled our Bill of Rights. Our First Amendment became history's most essential sentence, fit to be carved high on the walls of every public building, especially our schools and courthouses. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Unquote. Pronouncements like the Declaration of Independence, 1776, Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789, Economic Bill of Rights, 1944, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, enshrine our highest principles. But our Bill of Rights is the law. It guarantees the most basic freedoms: religion, speech, media, assembly, petition. It outlines due process. It bans self-incrimination, double jeopardy, spying, unwarranted search and seizure, arbitrary imprisonment, excessive bail, and torture. Remember that. Our complex, demanding contest between human rights and official tyranny has seesawed ever since. Through the cycles of our history, our worth as a nation has always rhymed with our effective commitment to those first 10 codicils. In 1791, Washington and his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, slapped frontier farmers with a hated whiskey tax. The angry agrarians grabbed the guns they'd used to beat the British and marched toward Philadelphia. But George had a new army. His ambitious Jamaica-born aide gladly used it to crush the rebels who'd won the revolution, but now lost the peace. 2 years later, Washington again walked away from power, declining a third term. Neither generals nor presidents, he said, should rule for life. It was his finest hour. George's eternally grouchy vice president, John Adams, took over, with his sensible feminist wife, Abigail, who might have made a better president. He maintained a stable post-war equilibrium. But John did taunt the slave owners by welcoming a representative of the Haitian Revolution to be the first free black man to dine with an American president. It would be a long time before that happened again. In 1800, Adams ran for re-election against his charming, devious, painfully shy vice president, Tom Jefferson. The founders actually believed that in their gentlemanly new republic, he who'd just lost the presidency would happily serve the winner as a faithful vice president. So when Jefferson lost to Adams in 1796, he became VP. It did not go well. In 1800, John had no idea that his, quote, good friend, Tom, secretly hired the scandal-monger James Callender to smear him in newspapers throughout the nation. Enraged by Callender's scurrilous trash, the absurdly thin-skinned Adams assaulted the First Amendment with the Sedition Act, still dangerously on the books. For daring to criticize a president, John fined and jailed Callender and others, including the illegitimate son of Franklin's illegitimate son. Abigail, who should have known better, went along. When the Electoral College gave Jefferson the White House, Adams stomped home the Quincy. Years later, when he learned Tom had hired the guy who'd smeared him, John apparently punched his hand into a door, breaking both. Typically, Jefferson failed to pay Callender. Callender retaliated by breaking the stories that introduced us to Sally Hemings. A lover of all things French, our third president was identified with a revolution that beheaded Franklin's friend Louis XV. A Red Scare / Great Fear spread amongst America's authoritarian elite. Yale's Puritan president, Timothy Dwight, a grandson of Jonathan Edwards, demanded new witch trials. Reverend Jedediah Morse howled out about a crazy, quote, Illuminati conspiracy, somehow involving the composer Beethoven. Like so many other tyrannical fanatics throughout our history, Morse promised to name Satan's insidious agents, but never did. To these early McCarthyites, godless rape, pillage, terror, and madness were on the march. Above all, they screamed that the incoming president, Thomas Jefferson, was a satanic revolutionary. In fact, he was an imperial moderate, an early Eisenhower. In the chilly fall of our first organic cycle, while he fathered Sally's final 3 children, our third president plunged the new nation into an industrial winter of material excess and the early birth pangs of a global empire that would be our ultimate downfall. Next, an irresistible aside, indigenous revenge or Tecumseh's curse? Around the time Francis Scott Key stuck us with the Star-Spangled Banner, we absorbed a, quote, curse that tracks the cyclical death and maiming of 7 presidents. The great Shawnee Tecumseh was our quintessential war chief. A charismatic genius, he was born under a shooting star in what's now southern Ohio. He spoke 5 languages and wanted the whites out of his homeland. During the War of 1812, Tecumseh bitterly renounced his British allies for their brutality and torture. His vision was of an all-indigenous union to reestablish control over their vast homeland. Reviving the role of Daganoweda, Tecumseh traveled throughout the indigenous East, trying to unite the tribes. To start, Tecumseh established a base at Tippecanoe in today's Indiana. He left his brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet, to maintain peace, while he went off to recruit the southern nations for a unified council of resistance. As Daganoweda had visited the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, Tecumseh now sought out the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, Choctaw, and others. But while he was gone, Tenskwatawa foolishly attacked U.S. forces commanded by General William Henry Harrison. Harrison jumped at the opportunity to wipe out the encampment, leaving the returning Tecumseh without a solid base. Isolated and overextended, the resistance faltered. In 1813, at Thames River, Harrison may have killed Tecumseh, but he never got the great chief's body. In 1814, Harrison was elected president as our next to last Whig. As he made clear in his inaugural speech, he demanded control of Indian lands. But during his very long rant, some say it lasted 3 hours, Harrison caught pneumonia. When he died a month later, many blamed it on, quote, Tecumseh's curse. The next 6 presidents elected on a 0 year, Lincoln, 1860, Garfield, 1880, McKinley, 1900, Harding, 1920, FDR, 1940, JFK, 1960, all died in office. Reagan, 1980, was shot but lived, sort of. The unelected George W. Bush has survived since 2000, as has Al Gore, who won the popular vote that year. We'll see what happens after 2020, if there's actually an election. Next, winter, the era of good feelings. Amidst a furor of fierce reaction, John Adams was reelected by popular acclaim. In 1800, straight up, Adams could have claimed 65 electoral votes, Jefferson just 62. But like the Constitution's ratification, the 1800 election was rigged. The founders gave slave owners 3/5 of a vote for each slave. None of them, of course, actually got a ballot. The quote bonus, unquote, gave Jefferson enough ill-got electors to give him a White House built by slaves who couldn't live in it, nor could their descendants until Michelle Obama. Adams's Federalist allies saw the soft-spoken Virginia as a screaming radical. Blood would be boiled, children raped, heads posted on spikes, buildings burned, order destroyed, the country bankrupted. But the terminally shy Tom, who never spoke in public, preferred consensus. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists, he said. Then he ushered in a chill winter's hibernation of industrial consolidation and imperial expansion. The new capital's seeds were sown at a dinner party Tom had hosted in 1790. He and Madison dined with Alexander Hamilton, who they both disliked. The feeling was mutual. But they had an issue. The slave owners hated coming to Congress in Philadelphia. While the masses were off doing the country's business, those pesky Quakers kept talking the slaves into running north to freedom. Hamilton was an abolitionist. His military lover, John Laurens, was dead. Married into a wealthy New York family, he fathered 8 children. He also fathered the corporate state. Alexander Hamilton wanted America run by a modern industrial oligarchy, not a medieval slaveocracy, or by the general public. He liked hard money and a clean balance sheet. The feds, he said, should pay off the debts the state ran up during the Revolution, then help fund a commercial industrial empire. Jefferson and Madison, the Virginia agrarians, were not inclined. But at this dinner, lubricated by Tom's fine wines, which he could not afford, the trio cut a deal. Jefferson and Madison would let Congress bail out the states. In exchange, Hamilton let the slave owners move the nation's capital from Philadelphia to a dismal southern swamp far away from those annoying Quakers. 10 years later, in 1800, the slave-built White House opened its doors briefly to John and Abigail Adams of Massachusetts. Then came Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, all Virginia slave owners. With them came Hamilton's dream of a corporate empire. In his seminal 1791 Report on Manufactures and other writings, Alex demanded that taxpayers fund our commercial industrial jumpstart. The rich would use our public money for a national bank and a manufacturing infrastructure. The new industrial elite would preach the gospel of, quote, the free market, unquote. Their Bible, Adam Smith's 1776 Wealth of Nations, worshiped the, quote, invisible hand of open competition. But Adam was a humanist. Those who actually read Smith's books know he feared the unregulated monopolies that would clog the markets and game the system. Without public vigilance, Smith warned, an iron oligarchy of corrupted wealth would drive us without pity to radical inequality and imperial overreach. No truer words were ever spoken. John Adams helped it happen. He knew Jefferson intensely disliked the staid jurist John Marshall, who was Tom's cousin. So as he exited the White House, John Adams made John Marshall Chief Justice. From 1801 to 1835, Marshall made the U.S. Supreme Court a mighty fortress for a rising corporate empire. Marshall's timing was perfect. We were exhausted by war and reaction. We were ready to get rich. And Jefferson kicked off an imperial juggernaut that, by 1991, would rule the world. In 1803, Tom sent American ships to what's now Libya, quote, the shores of Tripoli, unquote, to crush Barbary pilots who were messing with our trade. As in our Obama-Clinton return assault 208 years later, innumerable innocents died needlessly. Meanwhile, Tom borrowed $15 million from a British businessman to buy the massive Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi. The purchase doubled our size, trampled the indigenous, and violated Jefferson's alleged belief in limited government. But never mind. This was the portal to manifest destiny. Tom knew little of what he'd bought, but he wanted a place to send the eastern tribes, and he knew a steal when he saw one. Ironically, the purchase was made possible by Haiti's slave revolution, which terrified Tom and his fellow plantation owners. The French dictator, Napoleon, was using New Orleans to squeeze our commerce. War seemed inevitable, so he sent troops to tighten his grip. But France's sugar-growing colony of Hispaniola was along the way. The legendary Toussaint Louverture was leading 500,000 self-proclaimed Haitians in a war for freedom and independence. So Napoleon's racist plan was simple. His white troops would chop up the black rebels and then sail on to crush us in Louisiana. But Hispaniola became Napoleon's Vietnam. Toussaint made a souffle of the French troops, who never saw New Orleans. The white world never forgave Haiti for beating a European army, or for an anti-colonial revolution led by non-whites tinged with social democracy. Napoleon's troops never reached New Orleans. He grimly sold Louisiana to the U.S. Meanwhile, Jefferson's imperial legions fought pirates and slaughtered civilians in North Africa. Our race to global empire was on. Haiti's revolution struck terror in the hearts of all slave owners. 10 U.S. presidents refused to recognize the new nation or to send an ambassador. Lincoln finally did both in 1863. Meanwhile, the Brits messed with our trade, our sailors, our newborn national pride. After the 1783 truce with Britain, our infant nation wisely avoided war. Except for Tom's North African conquest and the ongoing slaughter of the indigenous, we kept our heads down. Under Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, the, quote, infant empire, unquote, took shape. Jefferson adopted Hamilton's commercial manufacturing vision. Abandoning their agrarian dreams, the end of ideology Virginians did the Hamiltonian thing of using the federal government to fund the infrastructure for a rising corporate state. But in 1812, imperial warhawks captured Congress. With the infantile idea of conquering Canada, our little army torched York, later Toronto. The Brits reciprocated by burning the White House. Little Jemmy barely escaped. At the ensuing battle of Fort McHenry, a slave-owning lawyer stuck martial lyrics, some blatantly racist, on an old drinking song. The unsingable mess morphed into a Star-Spangled Banner, for which unwilling athletes are forced to stand in violation of the First Amendment. Jimi Hendrix did play it best, wordlessly, at Woodstock 69. The era of good feelings was built around 3 consecutive two-term presidencies, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, which didn't happen until our Clinton, Bush II, Obama, end of empire coma, 2 centuries later. Meanwhile, this first winter of our material content demanded normalcy, not turmoil. Like the gilded 1890s, roaring 20s, fat 50s, me 70s, and greedy 80s to come, there was money to be made and land to be conquered. Few Americans bothered to read or vote. Wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson of Massachusetts, quote, from 1790 to 1820, there was not a book, a speech, a conversation, or a thought in the state, unquote. Living with Sally and their many children at Monticello, Jefferson was unhappy with the nation whose birth certificate he'd drafted. As president, he'd taken the first steps toward global empire. He, Madison, and then Monroe used much of Hamilton's federalism to fund infrastructure for a manufacturing juggernaut. In 1816, in his usual timeless, self-contradictory rhetoric, Tom warned against exactly what he'd helped create. Quote, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the law of our country." Unquote. In 1819, as always, there came a crack where the light got in. An irrationally exuberant stock market panicked and crashed. Monroe's second term plunged into chaos. Depression raged. Landlords went broke. Factories sold for pennies. Angry organizers birthed the first industrial unions. In 1824, J.Q. Adams, as Secretary of State, proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine. We claimed sovereignty over the entire Western Hemisphere. We warned Europe to forget about any involvement in any country on, quote, our side of the ocean, unquote. It was an astonishing imperial decree, totally at odds with the engine of our birth. For at least 2 centuries to come, it would make us Latin America's massa, with devastating consequences for all concerned. Next, Cycle 2, Manifest Adolescence. A burst of energy, Andrew Jackson. Andy Jackson trounced Adams too in 1824's popular vote. But JQ gamed the Electoral College to take the White House. The bad karma was instant. Quincy's presidency, like his dad's, was an unruly mess. By 1828, America's first cycle of conception, birth, awakening, war, reaction, and early material growth was done. We were Washington's, quote, infant empire, fully formed, twice our birth size, forever at war, crushing indigenous peoples everywhere. But internally, our postnatal ideological nap brought economic stability. Despite our 1812 tantrum, despite our 1812 military tantrum, we amassed great wealth, nurtured a nascent commercial industrial state, slipped comfortably numb into our first winter's fat, smug snooze. Then we got woke by a Tennessee wildman. Next, Cycle 2, Manifest Adolescence. A burst of energy, Andrew Jackson. At the dawn of our second cycle, amidst the chaos of economic depression, 4 men ran for president as Democrat Republicans. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee beat them all in 1824's popular vote, trouncing John Quincy 153,544 to 108,740. But Adams, too, used the Electoral College to hijack the White House. He disliked slavery, but he cut backroom deals with slave owners Henry Clay of Kentucky and South Carolina's John Calhoun. The outcome was a 1-term presidency, as tortured as his father's. Andy Jackson was not a gracious loser. He'd fought at least 14 duels. A bullet sat about an inch from his heart. To crush Adams, too, in 1828, Andrew formed the Democratic Party, a pillar of slavery, racism, and imperial assault for the next 19 decades. State-by-state abolition of property requirements for voting sent the overall national vote count soaring from around 350,000 in 1824 to more than 1 million in 1828, and Old Hickory was not to be denied. After leaving the White House in defeat, John Quincy Adams, served 17 years in Congress. He became a fierce abolitionist and our greatest ex-president. But for a generation of farmers and workers born after the Revolution, Andrew Jackson was the common man's messiah. A wild mob made a drunken brawl of his inauguration. With hair as good as Washington's and much better teeth, he never wore the wig of the old plantation elite. Andy was the orphan son of dirt-poor Irish immigrants. The rising industrial working middle class, much of it Irish, gave him a white urban base that stayed Democrat right through the New Deal and New Frontier. But for Old Hickory, money both talked and swore. An alleged labor man, he crushed a Union revolt on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. He hated Hamilton's National Bank, but slipped hard cash to cronies at the pet banks he set up to replace it. Jackson's violent contempt for women, blacks, Hispanics, the indigenous, ethical business practices, and the law itself defined our adolescent frontier individualism and set a low bar for the later coming of Donald Trump. Our Jacksonian adolescence came with a, quote, manifest destiny, unquote, to conquer the continent. Free Western land meant any white male elected by God or Ayn Rand could get rich by working hard, running slaves, killing Indians, gouging the earth, and bending the rules whenever money was to be made. Much started with Jefferson. In 1806, Tom promised sanctuary to the Delaware indigenous if they would adopt white ways and give up common ownership of tribal lands. But he'd already bought Louisiana and meant to ethnic cleanse the eastern indigenous across the Mississippi. In 1814, Jackson slaughtered some 800 Red Stick Creek men, women, and children at Horseshoe Bend. He sliced their corpses to make reins for his horses. Some 200 that escaped joined the Seminoles in Florida's Everglades, where they were never defeated. Many Cherokee went on to become successful farmers, merchants, bankers, and business managers. They devised a written language, wrote a constitution, published a newspaper, built a state capital, Ishota, ran 7 lumber mills. Their chief, the blue-eyed John Ross, ran a slave plantation near Chattanooga. Andy didn't care that the Cherokee had fought for him. His cronies robbed, raped, murdered, and pillaged whatever gold, timber, and land they wanted. When the Cherokee asked for federal protection, Jackson replied with the 1830 Indian Removal Act, demanding they move across the Mississippi into Jefferson's Louisiana. So the Cherokee petitioned for statehood. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled against that, saying that no state could be created out of an existing one, which Lincoln would do anyway for West Virginia in 1863. But Marshall also ruled the Removal Act unconstitutional. He confirmed the tribe's sovereignty. By federal law, the Cherokee could now enforce their own mandates. Later, they built their own casinos. And according to John Marshall, they could not be moved. President Andrew Jackson replied by telling the court and John Marshall and the Cherokee to drop dead. He would expel his former allies at gunpoint, and to hell with the Constitution. He also reserved major chunks of Cherokee land for himself and his cronies, making a Trump-style fortune along the way. In May 1838, Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, ripped children from their families and drove 14,000 Cherokee out of their homes and onto an open field, which was in essence a concentration camp. Without shelter, food, or recourse, about 1,000 Cherokee ran into the hills, where there's still a town called Cherokee. In the fall of 1838, federal troops forced the tribe onto the, quote, Trail of Tears, unquote, an 800-mile death march to Oklahoma. A quarter of them died. The gash still festers in our nation's soul. But some 10,000 Cherokee did make it to Oklahoma. They built a capital, New Eshota, a school system, a reborn society. Today, more than 730,000 strong, many Cherokee still avoid Andy's face on the $20 bill, hopefully soon to be replaced with Harriet Tubman's. In the Everglades, the renegade Seminole embraced runaway slaves and beat the U.S. in a 10-year guerrilla war. Masters of the Dismal Swamp, they ran rings around the regular U.S. Army. They remain a formidable power in Florida politics. In 1821, the Revolutionary Republic of Mexico abolished slavery. Then Mexico's leadership invited Tennessee frontiersmen to settle Texas, where they reintroduced slavery. In 1836, the Texicans rebelled. They lost the Alamo, but soon won their independence and demanded statehood. For 9 years, Mexico's threat of war and fierce abolitionist opposition to a new slave state kept Texas out of the Union. Then came Jackson's truest disciple, James K. Polk. Elected in 1844, the young Tennessee Democrat set out to conquer the continent. He offered the Mexicans cash for their lands north of the Rio Grande. They refused. So he proclaimed Texas a state and used a murky skirmish near the Nueces River to howl for war. With loud congressional approval, young Hickory sent U.S. troops pouring into Mexico City's halls of Montezuma. Abolitionists denounced this, quote, barbaric attack, unquote, as an imperial ruse to spread slavery. Transcendentalist Henry Thoreau refused to pay his taxes. Ralph Emerson preached nonviolence. Congressman Abe Lincoln of Illinois spoke passionately for peace, then did not run again. Neither did Polk. In his single term, 1845 to 1849, James K. grabbed the rest of what's now Texas, plus New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and parts of Oklahoma and Wyoming. He got Oregon and Washington from the Brits. He laid claim to Cuba. After all that acquisition, the exhausted conquistador quit the presidency in March 1849. James K. Polk dropped dead at 53 that June. In their outbursts of imperial energy, Jackson and Polk obliterated our post-revolutionary winter slumber. They retired the founders to the realm of past gods. Their manifest individualism sent a violent deluge of armed settler colonists pouring into the frontier. In those 1830s, 40s, and 50s, we were a hyper-energized adolescent, full of radical ideas and greedy aggression, racially bipolar, hell-bent for war, civil and imperial. But in literature, spirit, the arts, in feminism, abolitionism, communalism, a gorgeous creative spring, a second great awakening, burned a transcendent hole in our hot young soul. Next, springtime, the transcendentalists. As our youthful nation robbed the continent from the indigenous, there also came a springtime thrill of humanist passion. The reborn transcendent spirits that had aroused the American embryo in our first Great Awakening now soared with the better angels of our soul. In the 1830s, they roared to life in the arts, pouring from the souls of black folk and the indigenous, feminists and abolitionists, writers and poets, workers and activists, seekers and utopians, musicians and artisans. Throughout the cycles of our history, these ever-present upstarts awaken again and again with ascending force in the humanist wellsprings of our left-green dreams for social democracy and for organic spirituality. These days of magic were and continue to be a bucolic beauty. As always in America, it began with race. From the start, the South spewed a surreal, gone-with-the-wind mythology of happy black people swooning in awe of their beloved masses. But the slaveocracy knew better. It lived in constant terror of violent revolt. To own angry humans was to keep both feet on their necks. In the South's, quote, agrarian paradise, unquote, fear-based slave codes said blacks could not marry, own property, travel freely, meet together, talk back to whites, learn to read. The ceaseless torture and rape, murder and outrage imposed on chained chattel said the Southern elite knew full well its enslaved workforce was a seething volcano set to explode. Brilliant black writers and activists like Harriet Tubman, David Walker, Sojourner Truth, Robert Smalls, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Solomon Northup, Maria W. Stewart, Frederick Douglass, and so many more never stopped resisting. Douglass's autobiography, Northup's 12 Years a Slave, Walker's appeal made it clear that slavery's ultimate payback would be utterly terrifying. In the Civil War, more than 200,000 blacks staged their own war of liberation. At least 40,000 died fighting for freedom in Union Blue. They had powerful white allies. Tom Paine demanded abolition. Ben Franklin petitioned Congress for it. Much of Latin America embraced it in the 1820s. So did England in 1833. But white middle-class women, many of them Quakers, who worked for abolition, were blindsided in an ugly sexist ambush. During the Revolution, Abigail Adams's legendary 1776 letter to husband John demanded that he, quote, remember the ladies, unquote, when it came to equal rights. His snarky response set the tone for a pathetic strain of misogynist denial. Abigail and other war wives ran the farms, fields, and families. A half-century later, when their uppity daughters dared to speak in public against slavery, insecure men with small hands showered them with abuse and with vegetables. In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott sailed to London for a global abolitionist gathering. But the movement men, including Elizabeth's husband, whom she quickly left, treated the women with contempt. With righteous fury, in the heart of the Haudenosaunee country, a new generation of feminists convened humankind's first women's rights convention. There they proclaimed, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, close quote. Composed at Seneca Falls, New York, the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments proclaimed a reborn drive to matriarchy. Paulina Wright Davis published Una, our first feminist magazine. Lucy Stone kept her name after marriage, birthing a new generation of, quote, Lucy Stoners, unquote. Amelia Bloomer started wearing pants. Amidst an ecstatic spring of artistic genius, these uppity creatives planted the seeds of a reborn matriarchy. Louisa May Alcott, Herman Melville, Emily Dickinson, Edgar Allan Poe, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Sojourner Truth, Henry Longfellow, Margaret Fuller, and a holy host of rebel writers and thinkers, poets and songwriters, artists and activists, made our frontier culture a vibrant field of exceptional genius. Walt Whitman, our first gay laureate poet, sang The Body Electric. His seminal Leaves of Grass arose with our first gay president, James Buchanan. I know, quote Whitman, Moby Dick, Little Women, The Scarlet Letter, Summer on the Lakes, Fall of the House of Usher, Song of Hiawatha, headlined the era's creative treasures. Said the divine Emily Dickinson, quote, trade all you have or might have been for one small breath of ecstasy, close quote. Gorgeous, nature-based visuals by Albert Bierstadt, Frederick Church, Asher Durand birthed the Hudson River School of Painting. Thomas Cole's huge 5-phased pictures of the cycles of history still grace the Museum of the City of New York. Transcendentalist fire burned in dozens of utopian communities, which sailed the slipstream to the hippie 1960s. The Shakers, a Quaker offshoot formed by Mother Ann Lee, worked off their sexual energies with elaborate dances and really great furniture. The Mormon Church of the Latter-day Saints, formed in the 1840s, embraced polygamy and fled to a quirky, straight-laced life in Utah. The Oneida community loved, quote, complex marriage and disavowed, quote, exclusive affections, unquote. Their omnivorous mating rituals were elaborate and entertaining. Founder John Humphrey Noyes kept a log of sexual adventures. What was he thinking? Then fled to Vermont ahead of adultery charges. Simple systems of pre-industrial socialism and communal farming erupted everywhere. West of Boston, Brook Farm was home to an awakened literati. Owenites ran big, modern factories based on a communal feminism that opposed, quote, false notions of male dominance, unquote. At Utopia, Ohio, and Modern Times, New York, communities founded by Joseph Warren were open and anarchistic. In Concord, Ralph Waldo Emerson's amiable Unitarianism transcended the Puritans' hellish obsessions. His gentle spirituality embraced a natural kinship with Hindu and Buddhist laws of empathy and karma. Cut loose, Ralph could sound like a latter-day Jonathan Edwards in the Fields, or an early Yippie on LSD. Quote, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being, circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. Close quote. Emerson's hippie neighbor, Henry Thoreau, dove even deeper into the spiritual thickets. Ralph said his bearded naturalist buddy was like, quote, a bird or a fox, unquote, an indigenous soul in a white man's body. Henry spent endless hours watching ant colonies and birds' nests. His tripped-out musings on Mother Nature are gorgeous, loving, luminescent. H.D. Thoreau was also a pushy pacifist. He and Emerson had mixed feelings about industrial technology. They embraced its wonders, but feared its power. Quote, improved means without improved ends, close quote, could be a curse. But when it came to imperial war, they were perfectly clear. Thoreau hated Polk's attack on Mexico. He went to jail rather than pay taxes for it. His aunt bailed him out the next morning. Then he wrote the era's transcendent masterpiece, on peaceful resistance. Individualist to the core, civil disobedience asks simply that people of conscience resist evil, but without violence, that their rebellion be firm but civil, that they throw themselves into the cogs of a life-crushing machine and disobey evil until it surrenders. Thoreau condensed the core of Quaker principles into a sleek, secular shout. His civil disobedience remains an indelible monument to social change. It proposes to overcome armed injustice using only the mystical force of moral suasion. It says our species can survive and evolve through the steady willingness of civil individuals to stand peaceably but firmly for amity, equality, and ecological harmony. The ethereal, inexplicable, pulsating force of that transcendent ideal is what makes us human and bends our historic arc inevitably toward justice. No one has ever said it better than Henry David Thoreau. Civil disobedience was joined in 1848 by another pamphlet that shook the world. Writing in England, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto gave voice to a newborn labor movement's collective howl amidst a factory system gone absolutely mad with brutality and greed. The Industrial Revolution consumed human lives like chunks of coal. Marxism fused impoverished workers into organized resistance. They demanded higher wages, better working conditions, social justice, democratic rights, an end to imperial wars in which they ever fought and died for corporate profits. Workers versus owners, unions versus corporations, labor versus capital, immigrants versus the established, rich countries versus developing ones, humans with empathy and compassion versus those without. They all squared off in a life-death class struggle whose final outcome remains in doubt. But Marx's call was marred by a tragic phrase, dictatorship of the proletariat. In 1861, our rising industrial machine, with its imperial march into the indigenous West, turned our sweet transcendental spring into the deathly inferno of a hellish summer. Next, summer, the Civil War. Rare among slave owners, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were astute, passionate farmers. They embraced both the art of crop rotation and the science of contour plowing. They heaped glowing praise on their favorite plant, cannabis. They'd never have believed it would someday be illegal. Hemp made rope, sails, clothing, paper, food, building materials. George bought special seeds from India. Tom exulted that hemp was so much easier to raise than that demon weed, tobacco. Hemp was America's #2 cash cow. Had it been the South's core crop, chattel slavery could never have taken root. But King Cotton was a terrible tyrant. It addicted its debt-ridden growers to constant injections of cash. They grew it like tobacco on the same land year after year. They lacked fertilizer, a willing labor force, and an understanding of crop rotation. They wore out the soil, then moved west. It could not last. Starting at Jamestown in 1619, European slavers ripped anguished humans from a hugely diverse continent. The priceless agricultural skills that sustained Africa's deep, rich civilizations for countless millennia came with them. But the slave owners scorned the Africans' ancient wisdom. Their medieval South was a seething hell, ruled by smug totalitarians, awash in endless resistance. Historian Edward Baptiste wrote that especially in King Cotton's 1800 to 1861 ginned up boom time, white people inflicted torture far more often than in almost any human society that ever existed. Racism was the drug of choice. It meant to justify African enslavement and indigenous genocide. White, quote, Christians, unquote, anointed themselves as superior to fellow humans of color. Biblical passages were duly found to deify the unholy delusion. Free white Europeans pouring across the Atlantic shunned the slave South. So by 1860, the North counted some 21 million residents versus 9.5 million Southerners, nearly half of them black. Even with the 3/5 bonus, the slave owners could not keep up in Congress or the Electoral College. But still, they wanted Kansas and Nebraska. That's when our second cycle's hot summer burst into flame. After a murderous 1859 rampage through bleeding Kansas, the abolitionist John Brown and his sons attacked a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. They sought guns for a slave uprising. Brown was hanged by General Robert E. Lee, who made a name for himself in the Mexican War, then turned traitor. In 1860, the Democratic Party split. Angry Southerners wanted independence, the mouth of the Mississippi, the West. 4 million slaves were their primary capital asset. But Northern bankers, factory owners, and farmers would never let a hostile power control New Orleans or the Great Plains. Black and white abolitionists, South and North, feminist and otherwise, wanted slavery sent to oblivion. Abraham Lincoln became their intended instrument. Homeschooled and dirt poor, Lincoln became our quintessential common man. His hardscrabble father used him in a form of frontier servitude. But unlike so many other Jacksonians, Abe was not consumed by the quest for riches. A backwoods individualist, a rail-splitting wrestler, a self-taught attorney, he indulged in race jokes, thought to send blacks to Africa, renounced slavery while he spoke of saving the Union while preserving it. But having clawed his way to Congress, Lincoln denounced Polk's Mexican War, knowing this might cost him his career. His bipolar melancholia, darkened with a tough marriage, horribly cursed by the death of 3 young sons. Like FDR's polio and JFK's war wounds, Abe's personal demons forced him onto what historian William Appleman Williams called, quote, a quest for immortality and transcendence, unquote. Raised in nature, Lincoln willed parts of Yosemite to the new state of California for our first public land preserve. And in the era's single greatest sentence, Abe forever enshrined our national karma on slavery and war. The slaughter of civil war would rage, he said at his second inaugural in 1865, quote, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another, drawn with the sword, unquote. The slaveocracy's race-based caste system set white peasants at the throats of black slaves. Its confederacy was a feudal relic, the bastard spawn of a medieval elite. It could not last. The North was an emerging industrial superpower. An early techno-freak, Abe was our first, quote, wired president, unquote, the only one to hold a patent for a flotation device. In 1863, he established the National Academy of Sciences. He pushed hard for the Transcontinental Railway and dreamed of riding it to California. Lincoln telegraphed in real time directly to battlefields like Gettysburg, personally deploying observation balloons, ships, trains, arms, troops. He investigated a prototype machine gun that, thankfully, was not yet ready for mass slaughter. As our Civil War erupted, Russia's liberal Tsar Alexander II freed more than 20 million serfs. In 1861, they got full rights as citizens, including the ability to marry and run a business. Many also got the houses they lived in, and at least some of the land they'd worked for unpaid centuries. The aristocracy hated it, but this towering transition came largely without violence. America, on the other hand, was cursed with a much harsher form of inhuman servitude. The Northerners were of multiple mindsets. Transcendental abolitionists raged against the machine. White workers wanted Western farms. The rising robber barons wanted control of Congress and of the Mississippi, with license to loot the virgin resources of the South and West. But the North's urban working class mostly wanted nothing to do with this, quote, rich man's war, unquote. In 1863, Irish street gangs torched Manhattan. They lynched blacks they'd fought against for jobs and status. Their Democratic Party machines, like Tammany Hall, named for an indigenous chief, ran the Celtic barrios of the urban North in ways much like the Jim Crow South. This bloody class caste chasm fed the rising industrial rich. Like Washington during the First Revolution, Lincoln hesitated to accept African American soldiers into the Union Army, but he quickly realized the North couldn't win the war without them. The black abolitionist Frederick Douglass criticized Abe's slow pace, but he argued that, quote, though Mr. Lincoln shared the prejudices of his white fellow countrymen against the Negro, it is hardly necessary to say that in his heart of hearts he loathed and hated slavery, close quote. In 1863, Abe's Emancipation Proclamation fulfilled John Brown's mission. Black liberators now had guns. Said Douglass, quote, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter, U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship, close quote. That year, Harriet Tubman, the Black Moses, led a raid into Maryland with some 300 armed African Americans. They helped free at least 700 slaves. In the South, just one of every 20 white Confederate families owned 100+ slaves. They were the pompous descendants of the original Cavaliers, entitled, arrogant, obsolete. 8 of 10 white Southerners owned no slaves at all. Soon these po-white Johnny Rebs deserted the Confederate Army in droves. In Mississippi, the belly of the South, they made the Free State of Jones into a zone of multiracial liberation. To knuckle down the ranks, Lee's desperate officers one day hanged 22 deserters, marching their fellow gray grunts past the corpses. It didn't work. Nor did the slaughter of the indigenous. Amidst a war to abolish slavery, white Minnesotans meant to hang 303 Mandan who dared to demand supplies owed them under the usual broken treaty. Lincoln cut the kill list and paid Minnesota $2 million, far more than the tribes were owed. But on December 26, 1862, 38 indigenous died in U.S. history's biggest mass execution. Their families were then ethnic cleansed further west. That year, Congress, absent the slave owners, passed a Homestead Act granting western tribal lands to white settlers. In 1863, Lincoln finally recognized the Haitian Revolution, 60 years after Toussaint Louverture's black rebels beat the astonished French. On January 31st, 1865, Lincoln pushed the 13th Amendment by just 2 votes through a divided House. He prolonged the conflict and the killing to get it passed. Had he not, the Civil War might have ended with the peculiar institution completely intact. But the 13th Amendment's fatal flaw let Jim Crow racists impose, quote, involuntary servitude, unquote, through a hideous prison system. Lincoln still thought to compensate slave owners for their loss of, quote, property, while sending freed blacks, quote, back, unquote, to Africa. Wrote W.E.B. Du Bois, quote, Lincoln was impressed by the loss of capital invested in slaves, but curiously never seemed to seriously consider the correlative loss of wage and opportunity of slave workers, the tangible results of whose exploitation had gone into the planters' pockets for 2 centuries, close quote. But the 13th Amendment's fatal flaw let Jim Crow racists impose, quote, involuntary servitude, unquote, through a hideous Southern prison system. Lincoln still thought to compensate slave owners for their loss of property, while sending freed blacks, quote, back, unquote, to Africa, even though none of them had been born in Africa. Wrote W.E.B. Du Bois, quote, Lincoln was impressed by the loss of capital invested in slaves, but curiously never seemed to seriously consider the correlative loss of wage and opportunity of slave workers, the tangible results of whose exploitation had gone into the planters' pockets for 2 centuries. Lincoln nonetheless perpetrated, quote, the War of Northern Aggression, unquote. 200 Minnesota Mandan were mass hanged on his watch. He often shredded the Constitution at will. But in evaluating Abraham, we enter the dusk. Was his, quote, great civil war, unquote, one of human liberation or of corporate empire? Do we blame him for the hanging of those 38 Mandan, or do we credit him with saving the other 265 white Minnesotans wanted dead? Did preserving the Union justify 620,000 deaths, or does he deserve sainthood for barely winning abolition? Master of the possible, there was about this uncommon man a soulful depth shared only by an epic few. Melancholia was its wellspring, agonizing depressions with no pharma mendicants as seen on TV. For Jean Debs, the great leap came in prison. Helen Keller overcame her deaf blindness with astonishing majesty. FDR entered his personal hell with polio. Eleanor with her abusive parents. For Malcolm and Martin, it was the lifelong scourge of racism. Facing no such torture, JFK's inborn genius, he was known as a great listener, was driven ever deeper by his war wounds and Addison's. So what great resources now will we as a nation draw upon to find equilibrium on a desperately threatened planet? The assassin's gunfire that took so many of our heroes so young darkens the image, renders their realities hauntingly incomplete. But with Lincoln, as with Kennedy and Vietnam, we wonder most about what would have happened with Southern land had he lived. While marching through Georgia, General William Tecumseh Sherman, named for the great chief, he was still a horrific Indian killer, saw thousands of freed slaves following his army. Sherman promised them each 40 acres and a mule. Some occupied the plantations where they'd been born and enslaved. The general was fine with that. They were just repeating what our first revolutionaries had done to Tory land, confiscating and dividing it making it their own. Pennsylvania's Representative Thaddeus Stevens demanded more. Quote, "We especially insist that the property of the chief rebels should be seized and used for the payment of the national debt caused by the unjust and wicked war they instigated. The whole fabric of Southern society," said Stevens, "must be changed, and never can it be done if this opportunity is lost." Continuing the quote, "Russia's freed serfs got land and houses. Our new black citizens deserve no less than 40 acres and a mule." Quote, "Nothing will so multiply the production of the South as to divide it into small farms. Nothing will make citizens so industrious and moral as to let them feel that they are above want and are the owners of the soil which they till." Continuing the quote from Thaddeus Stevens, "No people will ever be Republican in spirit and in practice where a few own immense manors and the masses are landless. Small and independent landholders are the support and guardians of Republican liberties. The ex-slaves," concluded Stevens, "must not be left destitute. If we refuse compensation to this downtrodden and oppressed race, the rights which heaven decreed them, and the remuneration which they have earned through long years of hopeless oppression, how can we hope to escape still further punishment if God is just?" Close quote. Lincoln supported reparations for slave owners, but not for the slaves themselves. He was said to oppose distributing the plantations to the ex-slaves. But he owed them the Union victory and knew the brutality of a landed elite. Says Pulitzer Prize winner Eric Foner, quote, "Lincoln was certainly not in favor of redistributing Southern property, but he liked to allow different projects to go forward and see what happened. At Davis Bend, Grant divided the land among the slaves. Sherman did something similar. Lincoln said nothing, pro or con." Close quote. Congress in the Freedmen's Bureau Act envisioned blacks renting and then buying land. "The idea was in the air," said Foner, "but Andrew Johnson killed it." Close quote. Like the founders and so many other American icons, Lincoln remains an enduring, bitterly disputed enigma in our psychic pantheon. He was a tortured, uniquely compelling mix of warmth, wit, depth, complexity, wrought with contradiction, capable of growth. What truly haunts us is that only a peacetime presidency could have shown us the complete, honest Abe. Try as we might, we'll never know how he might have handled the epic challenges of Southern justice, racial reparations, Western land, indigenous rights, industrial democracy. What we do know, what really matters, is what did happen. To win re-election in 1864, Lincoln made Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Jacksonian, his VP. As with a later Johnson, we still pay a fearsome price. Andrew came drunk to Abe's second inaugural. As an unreconstructed racist, he killed the idea of redistributing plantations and a whole lot more. But in the hot summer of our Second American Revolution, the 13th Amendment abolished chattel slavery outside the prison system. The 14th meant to guarantee Southern blacks their basic human rights, soon hijacked by the corporations. The 15th pledged the right to vote regardless of race, a promise largely broken even today. A Civil Rights Act confirmed the solemn promise of racial justice, paid for in blood and then trashed by the Supreme Court. In 1869, the iron-fisted U.S. Grant sent in troops to reconstruct the South. They guaranteed the right to vote. Poor whites and blacks shared public offices. Their kids shared schoolrooms. Parts of the South sang of multiracial hope. Then came another cruel postbellum fall. A Jim Crow swarm of KKK terrorists raged through the Bible Belt, dressed like beds, torching crosses, raping innocents, lynching their own mixed blood cousins, turning into trash all they touched. Next, fall, Jim Crow Democrats and their KKK terror. At Appomattox, April 9, 1865, Lincoln's victorious Union responded to 4 years of ghastly carnage with one of history's most magnanimous gestures. Astride his horse Traveler, Robert E. Lee rode in to surrender. Scion of the slaveocracy, he wore his finest Cavalier grays. U.S. Grant came late. His shabby private's uniform was a muddy mess, but he was the victor. For a surreal moment, Grant and Lee chatted amiably about the Mexican War, where they'd met briefly. But then it was down to business. Quanah Parker, a Comanche war chief, kept the official record. Lee was a traitor. Lincoln had offered him command of the Union Army. Instead, he led a carnal crusade for history's most vicious form of human bondage. Many of the 620,000 dead now rotted under Lee's plantation, which became Arlington National Cemetery. By law, Grant could have hanged Lee, as Lee had done to John Brown 6 years prior. Instead, Grant asked how much food Lee's men needed. Grant offered 25,000 rations. He let Lee keep his sword. Rebel soldiers kept their sidearms and horses for spring planting. The victor, in one of history's bloodiest wars, took no prisoners, issued no indictments, staged no executions. It was an exceptional moment. It recalled Washington walking away from his Revolutionary Army and then again from the presidency. It signaled a time to clear wreckage, heal wounds, embrace an America free at last of chattel slavery. It was also a move of strategic necessity. Lincoln and Grant knew all too well what it might mean to fight an outlier army of angry gray guerrillas fanning into the hills and hollers, fields and forests. It was a lesson we learned in our own revolution, then forgot in the Everglades, Great Plains, Philippines, Korea, Vietnam, Central America, Iraq, Afghanistan, and wherever else our Calvinist empire has assaulted a local resistance. 2 days after peace, Lincoln and his son Tad walked Richmond's streets. They brought no military escort. They were mobbed by grateful free blacks and curious poor whites. Abe asked a band to play Dixie, then conversed with a free black man, horrifying the former slaveocracy. On April 14th, a deranged actor, working with at least 6 co-conspirators, put a bullet in the back of Abe's head. It was a ghastly plunge into eternal psychosis from which we've never really recovered. Soon after Appomattox, as Abraham moldered in his grave, Robert E. Lee became president of Washington College, later Washington and Lee. He lived until 1870 and oversaw the first U.S. college courses in business and journalism. Quote, "We have but one rule here," he wrote, "and it is that every student be a gentleman." Close quote. The KKK had no such concerns. Immediately, it launched a bloody Jim Crow rampage for caste, power, and property. Though they would deny it with violent outrage, countless Klansmen were themselves descended from raped slave women. Consider the progeny of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Sally's grandmother was an African who was raped by the white captain of the ship that brought her to Virginia. Their daughter, Betty, was then raped by her white owner, John Wales, to whom she bore as many as 6 children. Sally was the youngest. Sally's Virginia Massa thus fathered both women, one white, one black, who birthed the children of the 3rd president of the United States. 4 or 5 of Tom and Sally's 8 children lived to adulthood. 3 were born while he was president. 2 passed for white. So did scores of their progeny. The Wales, Hemings, Jefferson template, with white owners raping their black slaves, ruled the South. So let's ask the obvious question. How many of those white supremacist KKK fanatics have in fact been African American? How many were and are blood cousins to those they lynch? As of late 1865, more than 4 million American slaves were technically freed. But this monumental leap in our organic evolution gave the Democratic Party a political imperative. African Americans now comprised more than a third of many Deep South states. If they voted with liberal white Republicans, and there were a few, they could rule the former Confederacy. The party of Jackson responded with systematic murder. Over the next century, its KKK terrorists assassinated at least 4,000 African Americans. Some killings were random, but most were the targeted, intensely political purges of black women and men who dared to organize their communities. The lynch mob was the Democrats' key to control of the South and much of Congress. The 13th Amendment also allowed for, quote, involuntary servitude, unquote, in response to even minor and often non-existent crimes. So for 15 decades, millions of blacks, North and South, have been falsely imprisoned, stripped of their rights, plunged into virtual slavery, on chain gangs, in solitary confinement, and worse. With the party roles reversed, the same agenda would drive the Nixon-Reagan drug war after 1971. Andrew Jackson pardoned the slavocrats as if the war had never happened. The incompetent Trumpian bigot was impeached by the Republican House, but the Senate sadly failed, by 1 vote, to remove him. In light of many future presidents' illegal wars and dictatorial impulses, it would have set good precedent for the Congress to oust at least one out-of-control chief executive. In September 1868, in Opelousas, Louisiana, white supremacists murdered some 200 black children, women, and men and torched a duly elected black-white government. Similar political mass murders carried on throughout the post-war South. In 1869, Grant took the White House. He hated the Klan. He sent federal troops to reconstruct the region with guaranteed rights for both freed slaves and poor whites. The center held for 8 path-breaking years. Under federal protection, African Americans voted alongside whites. Together, they elected some 2,000 mayors and governors, reps and senators, sheriffs and dog catchers. In the Carolinas, Mississippi, Louisiana, the races worked in harmony for the first time since Bacon's Rebellion to improve education, business, government, sports, music, life. And then it crashed. In 1876, Grant failed to run for a 3rd term. He then wrote one of history's best-selling autobiographies, and just as he finished it, he died of cancer. In the 1876 general election, New York's Tammany Democrat Samuel Tilden beat Ohio's Rutherford B. Hayes by 250,000 ballots. But the Republicans stole enough electoral college votes to get a tie. For 5 months into 1877, the nation stood at the brink of a new civil war. Then came the deal. The Dems offered Hayes the White House if he would pull U.S. troops out of the South. Reconstruction would end. So would any hope of Southern equity. The Klan ran wild, with mass incarceration, targeted murder, beatings, rape, cross burnings, and more. The KKK Democrat terror retook Dixie. Facing literacy tests, the poll tax, the whites-only primary, and a cowardly new world of violent intimidation, the black vote disappeared. Buried under a rigged legal system and a brutal prison gulag, freed blacks were essentially re-enslaved. In March 1881, as the Klan ran wild, Russia's Tsar Alexander II was killed by youthful idiots claiming to be revolutionaries. Russia's Lincoln had a repressive side, but he was the last decent Tsar before the rise of Gorbachev, a century later. Here, on July 2nd, 1881, an unhinged office seeker shot our newly elected president, James A. Garfield. The beloved Ohioan was a gentle genius who could write simultaneously in Greek and Latin. Had he survived, Garfield might well have become a great president. To help save him, Alexander Graham Bell invented a device to find the bullet. But the bumbling Dr. Willard Bliss prevented its proper use, fed him a terrible diet, and turned Garfield into Tecumseh's third presidential victim. As the new century dawned, Jim Crow ran the industrializing New South with an iron fist. Legal segregation locked blacks and whites into unequal castes. Supreme Court dicta like Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, and Williams versus Mississippi, 1898, enshrined the new American apartheid. Blacks and whites were banned from playing sports, checkers, cards, or music together. The ruling elite fearfully segregated public schools, transportation, hotels, restaurants, lest blacks and whites once again get to know and like each other. In 1898, a white supremacist mob crushed Wilmington, North Carolina's duly elected mixed-race government. Some 60 people were slaughtered. More than 2,000 fled town. It was Reconstruction's fatal fall freeze. Southern slavery was now gone, but its freed victims were destitute, disenfranchised, disempowered,